Greetings, and let us discuss the Renaissance north of the Alps. Now, despite contacts between Italy and Northern Europe, the innovative artistry and learning of Italy was not exported across the Alps until the late 15th century. Northern European intellectual life was dominated by the universities whose curricula focused on logic and Christian theology. Northern European scholars were influenced by the Italian ideas, which usually worked outside the university system, under the private patronage of kings and princes. As royal courts became more firmly established in royal capitals, kings needed to impress townspeople, courtiers, and visitors. Before 1500, northern rulers were less committed to patronizing artists and intellectuals than were the city states of Italy, where patronage was an arena for competition. In Northern Europe, political units were larger and political rivals were fewer.
Renaissance movement in Northern Europe ultimately will differ from Italy. They will graft certain Italian ideals onto pre existing traditions, Christian humanism. Northern humanists are more committed to seeking ethical guidance from biblical and religious precepts, as well as from, say, Cicero or Virgil. They would embrace the wisdom of antiquity, but Christian and classical will somewhat clash. The antiquity of the New Testament and the early church will come to terms. Although Northern artists would be inspired by the accomplishments of Italian masters, they depicted classical subjects less frequently and would rarely portray nude figures. As an example, look at Erasmus here. This is by Hans Holbein the Younger. Yes, that Hans Holbein. This is generally regarded as the most evocative portrait of the preeminent Christian humanist. I hope you can see the sarcasm here. It's really evocative, isn't it? So evocative.
Desiderius Erasmus, who lived between 1469 and 1536, was the illegitimate son of a priest born near Rotterdam. He was forced into a monastery when he was a teenager. He found little useful instruction there, but plenty of freedom to read what he liked. He devoured all the classics he could get his hands on, alongside the writings of the Church Fathers. At about 30, he enrolled in the University of Paris and completed the requirements for a bachelor's degree in divinity.
Erasmus became the leader of a humanist coterie. As a Latin prose stylist, Erasmus was unequaled since the days of Cicero. Erasmus' Latin style and humor earned him a wide audience. He intended everything he wrote to promote what he called the philosophy of Christ. At least he could do it with a smile. Erasmus believed that the society of his day had since lost sight of the gospel's teaching. He offered contemporaries three different kinds of writings: clever satires in which people could recognize their own foibles, serious moral treatises meant to offer guidance toward proper Christian behavior, and scholarly editions of basic Christian texts. He rebelled against the arid learning of the Parisian academe and made his living from teaching and writing. He traveled often to England, stayed for 3 years in Italy, resided in different cities in Germany and the Low Countries before ultimately settling in Basel.
We can look at the works of Erasmus. His satires, The Praise of Folly, in 1509, which ridiculed pedantry and dogmatism, ignorance and gullibility. The colloquies in 1518 held up contemporary religious practices for examination. We have his moral treatises, The Handbook of the Christian Knight, 1503, which used the popular language of chivalry as a means to encourage a life of inward piety. His complaint of peace in 1517 argued in favor of Christian pacifism. Erasmus brought out reliable printed texts for works of Augustine, Jerome, and Ambrose. After reading Lorenzo Valla's Notes on the New Testament in 1504, Erasmus became convinced that scriptures were replete with transcription and translation errors. He spent 10 years comparing all the early Greek biblical manuscripts he could find in order to establish an authoritative text. His textual scholarship, in 1516, he published the Greek New Testament, published with explanatory notes and his own new Latin translation. It became an important scholarly landmark.
After a successful career as a lawyer and Speaker of the House of Commons and Parliament, Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, was appointed Lord Chancellor of England in 1529. Shame he would only see the job for 6 years. He opposed King Henry VIII's plan to establish a national church under royal control and would be executed and, of course, revered as a martyr. In 1516, More published his most famous book, The Utopia, purporting to describe an ideal community on an imaginary island. The book is, of course, really an Erasmian critique of contemporary culture. Disparities between poverty and wealth, drastic punishments, religious persecution, and the senseless slaughter of war. Erasmus and More would head a long list of eloquent northern humanists who made contributions to the enterprise of revolutionizing the study of early Christianity, and their achievements had a direct influence on Protestant reformers, yet few of them would be willing to join Luther in ultimately rejecting the Roman Church. More, in contrast to Erasmus, will see the inhabitants of the fictional utopia hold all their goods in common, work only 6 hours a day, and practice the natural virtues of wisdom, moderation, fortitude, and justice.
Here we have a depiction of Sir Thomas More by, again, Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein's skill in rendering the gravity and interiority of his subjects is matched by his masterful representation of the sumptuous chain of office, furred mantle, and velvet sleeves that indicate the political and professional status of Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor.
Artistic renaissance in the North will flourish. Poets in France and England vied with one another to adapt the elegant lyric forms pioneered by Petrarch and popularized by many subsequent poets, including Michelangelo. Yes, he was also a poet. The sonnet was influential and would become one of the verse forms embraced by William Shakespeare. Remember, Shakespeare's pretty much contemporary to this point. 1554 to 1616. We think it's still debated. Another English poet, that is to say, Edmund Spenser, 1552 to 99, drew on the literary innovation of Ariosto's Orlando Orozio. Spenser's Faerie Queene is a similarly long chivalric romance that revels in sensuous imagery. Gargantua and Pantagruel, a series of chronicles describing the lives and times of giants whose fabulous size and gross appetites serve as vehicles for much lusty humor. Like Erasmus, Rabelais satirized religious hypocrisy, scholasticism, and superstition. He wrote in extremely crude French and glorified every human appetite as healthy. Leave it to that man to have a fart kink. Satirical side of Renaissance humanism embraced by the French writer Francis Rabelais, 1490,
Francois Rabelais.
whatever, it's French. What he said. A practicing physician, Rabelais interspersed his professional activities with literary endeavors.
Classical values of Italian architects can be seen in some of the elegant new chateaus constructed in France's Loire Valley and in the royal palace of the Louvre in Paris. Influence of Renaissance ideals visible in the work of the German artist Albrecht Dürer from 1471 to 1528. He was the first Northerner to master the techniques of proportion and perspective, shared with the contemporary Italians a fascination with nature and the human body. He took advantage of the printing press to circulate his works to a wide audience, making his delicate pencil drawings into engravings that could be mass produced. Hans Holbein the Younger, from 1497 to 1543, painted portraits of Erasmus and his friend Sir Thomas More. These two portraits exemplify a Renaissance emphasis on the making of naturalistic likenesses that express human individuality. Albrecht Dürer never embraced classical subjects and drew inspiration from more traditional Christian legends and the Christian humanism of Erasmus, the engraving of St. Jerome.
So, St. Jerome here, as we can see, is in his study. Jerome, the biblical translator of the 4th century, cast your mind back to chapter 6. He's a hero to both Dürer and Erasmus, the paragon of inspired Christian scholarship. Note how the scene exudes contentment, even down to the sleeping lion, which seems more like an overgrown tabby cat than a symbol of Christ.
Now let's look at the Ars Nova, which we can translate as new art. We have Guillaume de Marchand, circa 1300 to 1377, and Francesco Landini,
Bless you.
from 1325 to 1397. We have part songs and ballads expanded on earlier genres of secular music, but the greatest achievement was highly complicated and yet a delicate contrapuntal style adopted for the liturgy of the church. Marchand's polyphonic, which is harmonized, setting of the major sections of the Mass in the earliest by a single composer. By 1500, Franco Flemish composers dominated important courts and cathedrals, creating a variety of styles that bear a close affinity to Renaissance art and poetry. Unlike painting and sculpture, Renaissance musical practice did not reach back to classical antiquity, but drew on medieval conventions. Even before the Black Death, a musical movement called Ars Nova was already flourishing in France. General level of musical proficiency was high. The ability to read a part of at sight was part of an elite education. Aristocratic women were expected to display mastery of new musical instruments: the lute, the viola, the violin, and the harpsichord. Most composers were trained by the church, and they rarely made sharp distinctions between sacred and secular music.
In 1494, the French king, Charles VIII, expanded his reach into Italy. He would lead an army of 30,000 troops, aided by an alliance with the Duchy of Milan. He would intend to press his ancestral claim to the Kingdom of Naples. By the time Charles left a year later, this effort yielded only a tenuous hold on Naples, while solidifying Italian opposition to the French occupation. The rulers of Spain will claim that Sicily and Naples forged an uneasy alliance along with the Papal States. Some principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, Milan, and Venice. After the Hundred Years' War, the French monarchy was able to rebuild its power and prestige while extending its control, and until 1529, warfare in Italy was virtually uninterrupted. Alliances, counter alliances among city states would become further catalysts for violence and made Italy a magnet for mercenaries. The northern Italian city states' virtual monopoly of trade with Asia was gradually eroded by the shifting trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. They would also be hampered by the Ottoman Empire and by imperial pretensions with a new Russian ruler. But we'll get to him in a second. Charles' successor, Louis XII, launched a second French invasion in 1499 with about as much success.
Let's look at the power of Ivan the Great. Ivan III, also known as the Great, who reigned between 1462 and 1505, was the first Muscovite prince to adopt an imperial agenda. He launched a series of conquests that annexed all the independent principalities between Moscow and the border of Poland and Lithuania. He invaded Lithuania in 1492 and in 1501, bringing parts of that domain under his control. He married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. This alliance inspired later Russian rulers to claim that Moscow was the third Rome, and they were heirs of the Caesars, hence the title Tsar or Tsar. Moscow emerged as the administrative capital under the Mongols, and then became the center of an independent principality, the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. He rebuilt his fortified Moscow residence, known as the Kremlin, in Italianate style. By the time of his death in 1505, Muscovy was established as a dominant power on the frontier of Eastern Europe.
To give you a visual, here's a map of the expansion of the Muscovite territory as of 1505, with the Grand Duchy of Moscow, also known as Muscovy, as the heart of what would become his empire. With what other empires and polities were the Muscovites competing with during this period of expansion?
To win the support of kings against the conciliarists, popes negotiated a series of treaties known as concordats, which granted rulers extensive authority over churches within their domain. Kings now received many of the revenues that had previously gone to the papacy. Kings acquired new powers to appoint candidates to church offices. These methods did nothing to enhance the Pope's reputation for piety. Disillusionment with the papacy became more widespread. Secular rulers presented themselves as moral reformers, resulting in a link between national monarchies and national churches. Here we have an Italian Renaissance cathedral in Muscovite Rus. Even the Great commissioned the Italian architect Aristotele Fioravanti to build this cathedral, dedicated to the Blessed Virgin and honoring her assumption into heaven. It is now part of the Kremlin Palace complex in Moscow. Why would Ivan chose to build this cathedral and commission this particular architect? What messages might he have been trying to convey?
Now, let's cut away from Ivan to some papal reforms to wrap things up. The drastic reversal of the reforms, which had created a powerful papacy at this point, the papacy would become even more dependent on its territories in central Italy for revenue. Remember, the Pope is relatively weak in Italy. To tighten their hold on the papal states, popes at least attempt some reform. Number one, they had to rule like other Italian princes, leading armies, jockeying for alliances, and undermining their opponents by covert operations and assassinations. And these are popes we're talking about. By secular standards, these efforts would pay off, and the Papal States would become one of the better governed and wealthier principalities within Italy. This ultimately builds to the Council of Constance, or Council von Constance, if you're a good German like me, which is an numerical council of the Catholic Church held from 1414 to 1418 in the bishopric of Constance in present day Germany. It was the first time a ecumenical council was convened in the Holy Roman Empire. The council ended the Western Schism by deposing or effectively accepting the resignation of the remaining papal claimants and electing Pope Martin V. It is the last papal election to take place outside Italy, thank God. And with those papal reforms out of the way, the Muscovites on the rise, humanists, and the effectively birth of Renaissance conflict all out of the way, Europe will stop turning their attention inwards and now turn their attention outwards as we expand, looking west and south as the true imperial age begins and the last part of chapter 12 will come to fruition. But enough of that. Tune in for part 3. Take it easy.